The railway stretched endlessly across the Montana plains, a thin line of steel cutting through a vast wilderness where the horizon seemed to swallow the sky. The year was 1896, and the railway had become both a lifeline and a graveyard for many wandering souls in America. Towns were born alongside its tracks, fortunes made and lost with the passing of locomotives that carried goods, people, and whispers of opportunity across the land. But on one storm-ridden night, the railway was the stage for a story that did not belong to trains or commerce, but to two broken people destined to collide in the most unlikely way. Ethan Cole walked along the rails with steps that betrayed both exhaustion and finality. He had been a soldier once, hardened by battles that left scars deeper than flesh. When he returned home, the land was no longer the same. The farm he had grown up on was gone, swallowed by debt and drought. His parents had passed during his absence, and his fiancée Tilda copyright, believing him dead, had married another. The America that people spoke of as the land of promise had turned its back on him, or so he believed. By the time he wandered into the small railway town of Larkspur, he was a ghost of a man, carrying nothing but the weight of memory and a silent wish to disappear. That night the storm had swept across the plains with merciless force. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the iron rails like a warning from the heavens. Ethan staggered, his clothes soaked through, his boots heavy with mud. He knew the schedule of the freight trains well enough. He had heard the whistle earlier in the day, and he knew another was due before midnight. The thought that had haunted him for months finally found a stage. The railway would be his resting place. He would lie down upon the steel, let the whistle be his last song, and surrender to an end that required no courage, no fight. It was, to him, the only way to silence the torment inside. When he finally collapsed on the tracks, the cold steel pressed against his cheek. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, and his lips parted to whisper words meant only for the wind. "Please," he murmured, "let me die on the railway." It was not a cry of drama, but of surrender, as if asking permission from fate itself. His body trembled, not entirely from the cold but from the release of decision. For the first time in years, he felt that he no longer needed to carry the burden of tomorrow. But fate has a habit of listening when people least expect it, and often it answers in ways no one foresees. As the thunder rolled and the distant rumble of a locomotive began to echo across the night, another figure emerged near the station. Clara Whitmore had heard the whistle too, though for her it was not a call to death but a reminder of how far from home she had traveled. Clara was unlike anyone in town. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and built with the strength of a farmhand, she had been brought to America as a mail-order bride. Her journey across the ocean had been one of hope, of letters exchanged with a man who promised love, family, and stability. But when she arrived months ago, the man never appeared. Rumor spread quickly in towns like these, and Clara became both a curiosity and a target. Some mocked her size, others feared her presence. Alone and abandoned, she found small work carrying timber, tending fields, and helping the widows of the town with chores that required strength. Yet beneath her towering frame was a loneliness as deep as Ethan's despair. Clara had taken to walking near the railway at night, a place where she could listen to the rhythm of the trains and imagine she was somewhere else, somewhere she belonged. That evening, the storm had driven her from her cabin, restless energy pushing her toward the tracks. When her sharp eyes caught the figure lying motionless on the steel, her heart clenched. At first she thought it a trick of the lightning, but as she drew closer, she saw him drenched, broken, and waiting for death. The ground trembled. The whistle screamed in the distance. Clara did not think. She ran. Her large strides carried her across the mud and gravel until she was upon him. Dropping to her knees beside Ethan, she heard his faint whisper again, a plea for death. But Clara had already made her choice. "No one dies tonight," she said, her voice firm yet strangely tender. With effortless strength, she lifted him into her arms, his thin frame no heavier to her than a child. Ethan tried weakly to resist, his voice breaking. "Leave me. Please. I've got nothing left." His eyes searched hers, perhaps hoping she would understand and let him go. But Clara, who had known abandonment in her own way, shook her head. "I will not," she answered simply, and carried him off the rails. The freight train roared past seconds later, iron wheels screaming against the tracks, steam filling the air with a deafening hiss. Ethan closed his eyes, his body trembling in Claire's arms. The moment that should have been his end had passed, stolen from him by a stranger whose arms felt both alien and strangely safe. Clara walked through the rain with him cradled against her chest, her long stride steady, her eyes fixed on the small wooden cabin she had built near the edge of town. Ethan, too weak to resist further, surrendered not to death, but to her strength. Inside the cabin, Claire laid him gently on a cot near the fire. She stoked the flames until the warmth began to drive away the chill of his soaked clothes. Ethan's eyes fluttered open, catching glimpses of the simple home at the wooden table, the herbs hanging to dry, the sturdy tools lined neatly against the wall. Claire worked silently, boiling water, tearing strips of cloth for bandages, and wrapping his cuts with hands both skilled and gentle. Ethan tried to speak, to ask why she had bothered, but his voice failed. The only sound was the crackle of fire and the soft hum of Clara's breath as she worked. When at last she sat beside him, her towering figure casting a long shadow across the room, Ethan found enough strength to whisper, "Why a broken bar? Why save me?" Clara looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. "At last," she said, "because I know what it is to be left behind. To feel there is no place for you in this world. But you are wrong if you think death is the answer. I could not let another soul vanish like that." Her words were not poetic, but they carried a weight that sank into Ethan's tired heart. He turned his face away, unwilling to admit that her strength unsettled him not with fear, but with the strange stirrings of hope. That night, as the storm raged outside, Clara sat awake beside him, watching the firelight flicker across his face. She thought of the man who had abandoned her, of the nights she had spent alone wondering if she had been brought across the ocean only to become a ghost in someone else's land. Now, beside her, lay another ghost, a man who had chosen the railway as his grave. And though she did not yet know why fate had brought them together, she knew one thing with certainty: she had pulled him from the tracks, and now she would not let him go. Ethan drifted in and out of sleep, haunted by memories of battlefields, of family graves, of the whistle of bullets and trains alike. Each time he startled awake, Clara was there, her large hand resting lightly on his shoulder, steadying him. He wanted to hate her for denying him the end he had sought, yet something inside him whispered that perhaps she had saved not just his body, but the small spark of his soul he thought long extinguished. For the first time in years, as the storm began to fade and dawn crept toward the horizon, Ethan felt the unfamiliar weight of being alive, not because he had chosen it, but because someone else had chosen it for him. Morning broke slowly across the Montana plains, painting the horizon in streaks of pale gold and silver. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that felt both heavy and cleansing. Ethan stirred beneath the coarse wool blankets, blinking against the soft light that filtered through the cabin window. For a moment he did not remember where he was. His body still ached, his clothes still damp in places, but the iron weight of the railway beneath him was gone. Instead, there was warmth. The crackle of fire still lingered, and the faint smell of bread baking made his empty stomach tighten. Then his eyes fell on her. Clara sat by the fire, her long frame bent over a sewing needle, mending the shirt he had worn the night before. She worked in silence, her hands large but precise, as though she had learned long ago how to balance her strength with patience. Ethan shifted on the cot, drawing her attention. She looked up, her eyes calm, unreadable yet strangely kind. "You're awake," she said softly. He swallowed, his throat dry. "Why?" His voice cracked. "Why didn't you let me go?" Clara studied him for a moment, then set the needle down. "Because the tracks don't deserve another ghost," she replied. "And because I was there." Her words were plain, but they struck him harder than he expected. He wanted to argue, to tell her that he had nothing to live for, but the effort seemed useless. His body was weak, his will even weaker. So he turned his face back to the fire and let silence settle between them. Over the next days, Clara tended to him with a care that was both practical and unexpectedly gentle. She fed him broth when he was too weak to eat solid food, changed his bandages with steady hands, and kept the fire burning through the cold nights. Ethan found himself watching her, studying the lines of her face, the quiet determination in her movements. There was no pity in her actions, only a kind of stubborn resolve. She did not treat him as fragile or hopeless, but as someone who still had worth, even if he could not see it himself. At first, Ethan resisted. He kept his words short, his eyes lowered. He did not want to depend on her. But Clara had a way of breaking through the walls he had built. When he muttered that he should not be taking her food, she replied simply, "I have enough. And if I don't, we'll make more." When he said he had nothing to give back, she answered, "Then give me your company until you can give me something else." These words confused him, unsettled him even more than her strength. No one had spoken to him like that since before the war, since before the world had turned cruel. Outside the cabin, the world moved on. The townsfolk of Larkspur noticed Clara less and less as time passed, though whispers still followed her. Children stared at her towering frame, and some men, fueled by drink, laughed at the thought of a woman taller and stronger than themselves. Yet Clara bore it all with the quiet dignity, never returning anger for insult. Ethan saw this and marveled at her resilience. In a world that had mocked her, she had built her own place, with her own hands, and now she had opened it to him. As his strength returned, Ethan began to help. First in small ways, fetching water from the stream, chopping kindling, then in larger tasks like repairing fences and carrying supplies. Though Clara could lift logs with ease, she never made him feel useless. She worked beside him, her presence steady, her laughter rare but genuine when it came. Slowly, almost against his will, Ethan began to feel alive again. The routine of work, the warmth of meals shared by firelight, and the sound of Clara humming as she cooked began to stitch him back together. At night, when sleep eluded him, Ethan sometimes spoke of his past. He told Clara about the battles he had fought, about the farm that had vanished, about the fiancé copyrightee who had moved on. His voice would falter, but Clara never interrupted. She listened, her silence more comforting than words. When at last he finished, she only said, "You've carried too much alone. You don't have to anymore." Those simple sentences broke something inside him. For years he had believed his burden was his own to bear, that no one would understand. Yet here was a woman, herself abandoned, offering not just shelter but a place in her world. The town began to notice the change in Ethan. Once seen as a ragged drifter, he now stood straighter, his clothes mended, his eyes clearer. When he walked beside Clara to the market, people stared at some with curiosity, some with unease. The sight of the giant woman and the haunted man together stirred gossip. But Ethan no longer cared. For the first time since he could remember, he felt he had something worth defending, worth staying alive for. Clara's cabin was no longer just her home, it was becoming his as well. Seasons shifted. The harsh winter thawed into spring, and the valley bloomed with wildflowers. Ethan and Clara worked side by side to plant a small garden, tending the soil with the same care they had begun to tend each other. On long evenings, they walked near the railway, the same place where their paths had first crossed. Ethan would glance at the steel tracks, remembering the night he had chosen death. Each time, Clara's hand would brush against his, grounding him in the present. One evening, as the train thundered past, Ethan said quietly, "That night, I wanted the tracks to take me. Now, when I hear the whistle, I think of how you carried me away from them." Clara met his gaze and replied, "Perhaps the tracks were meant to bring us together, not take you away." Ethan's heart stirred at her words. It frightened him, the thought of feeling again, of allowing himself to hope. But he could not deny that Clara had become the anchor he had needed for so long. In her presence, he was not a broken soldier or a forgotten man. He was simply Ethan, alive, working, laughing, and slowly finding his place in the world again. Clara, too, was changing. For years she had lived as an outcast, her size making her both useful and feared, desired only as a novelty in letters from across the ocean. But with Ethan she felt seen, not as a giant or as someone abandoned, but as a woman. He admired her strength without mockery, and when he looked at her, it was not with the eyes of a stranger but of a companion. The loneliness that had clung to her for years began to fade. One summer evening, the two sat by the fire after a long day's work. The air was warm, the sound of crickets filling the silence. Ethan broke it first. "Clara," he began, his voice hesitant, "that night on the tracks, I thought I was finished. I thought the world had no place left for me. But to a broken bar you gave me something I didn't know I could have again." He paused, searching for the right words. "You gave me a reason." Clara's eyes softened, though her face remained steady. "And you gave me one too," she said. "When I carried you from the railway, I thought I was saving you. But you've been saving me too, in ways you don't even see." Ethan reached for her hand then, his fingers wrapping around hers. The size difference was striking, his hand swallowed by hers, but the fit was perfect all the same. They sat like that in silence, the firelight flickering over their joined hands, each understanding without saying more that their lives had intertwined in a way neither had expected but both now needed. As the weeks turned into months, the bond between them deepened. They were no longer two broken souls surviving out of necessity. They were partners, companions, and something more unspoken. The railway, once a place of death for Ethan, became a symbol of life. Every time the whistle blew, he remembered not the night he chose to die, but the night Clara chose to carry him instead. And so, the story that began with despair found its way to hope. Ethan Cole, the man who had once whispered for death, discovered in the arms of a giant mail-order bride not just survival, but a future. Clara, the woman once abandoned and ridiculed, discovered in Ethan a man who saw her for who she was, not what she looked like. Together, in a small cabin by the tracks of Montana, they rewrote their fates, proving that sometimes the most broken people can build the strongest bonds, and that life has a way of giving back when all seems lost.